Go ahead, the billionaire CEO said with a smile that drew a few quiet laughs around the boardroom table. I dare you. Nobody expected the single dad sitting at the far end of the room to accept that challenge. And nobody, not the executives, not the investors, not even the woman who built the company, had any idea that within the next hour, one overlooked detail would place a $700 million deal on the edge of collapse. The executive conference center on the 42nd floor of Hale Dynamics overlooked downtown Chicago like a glass castle suspended above the city. Morning sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long golden reflections across polished walnut tables and sleek presentation screens. The room carried the familiar scent of fresh coffee, expensive leather, and confidence. Lots of confidence. At the center of it all stood Victoria Hale. At 38 years old, she had become one of the most admired CEOs in America. Business magazines called her fearless. Investors called her brilliant. Employees called her demanding. Today, she was preparing to finalize the largest acquisition in her company's history. $700 million. The number glowed proudly on the massive screen behind her. Around the table sat analysts, vice presidents, attorneys, consultants, and board members. Everyone seemed energized by the excitement of the announcement. Everyone except Ethan Brooks. Ethan sat quietly near the back wall, reviewing a spreadsheet on a company-issued laptop. Unlike the others, he wore no designer suit. His navy blazer showed signs of age around the cuffs. His tie was simple, his expression calm. Most people in the room barely knew his name. He was a temporary contractor, a short-term data analyst brought in during the final stages of the project. Easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. Ethan stared at a cluster of numbers. Then he stared again. Something felt wrong. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. One data source. One forecasting variable. One assumption hidden deep inside thousands of pages of financial modeling. The kind of thing most people would never notice. The kind of thing that could quietly become a disaster. Victoria continued speaking. This acquisition positions us for the next decade of growth. Applause followed. Several executives nodded enthusiastically. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the screen. His heartbeat stayed steady, but his concern grew heavier with every passing second. He checked the calculations again. Then a third time. The numbers reached the same conclusion. The projection wasn't just optimistic. It was fundamentally flawed. Ethan slowly raised his hand. A few people turned toward him, surprised. Victoria paused. Yes. Ethan cleared his throat. I think there may be a problem with the forecast model. Silence lingered for a moment. Then someone chuckled. Another executive exchanged an amused glance with a colleague. Victoria folded her arms. A problem? Yes, Ethan said calmly. A significant one. More smiles appeared around the room. The confidence that had filled the boardroom moments earlier now carried a trace of condescension. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Our model was reviewed by 3 consulting firms and 2 internal teams. Ethan nodded respectfully. I understand. And you believe they all missed something? The room waited. Ethan looked back at the screen. I believe everyone may be looking at the same mistake. The smiles faded just enough for uncertainty to enter the room. Victoria studied him for several seconds. Then she smiled again, this time sharper than before. Well then, Mr. Brooks, she said, her voice carrying across the boardroom. I dare you to prove it. The room erupted with quiet laughter. Ethan didn't laugh. He simply looked at the projection one more time. Because what he had just discovered might not only destroy the deal, it might expose a mistake so large that everyone in the room would remember this morning for the rest of their lives. Ethan Brooks did not answer immediately. While the laughter slowly faded around the boardroom table, he simply lowered his hand and looked back at his laptop screen. The executives interpreted his silence as uncertainty. A few assumed he regretted speaking up. Victoria Hale moved on with the presentation, and within minutes the conversation returned to revenue forecasts, shareholder expectations, and growth projections. But Ethan barely heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on the numbers. Sometimes the truth arrived loudly. Sometimes it appeared as a tiny inconsistency buried beneath layers of confidence. By the time the meeting ended, Chicago's afternoon sunlight had shifted across the glass towers outside. Executives gathered their tablets and coffee cups. Conversations buzzed with excitement about the deal. Ethan quietly packed his laptop into a worn leather bag and headed toward the elevator. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked what he had seen. Nobody seemed concerned. 45 minutes later, Ethan was driving north through light traffic in his aging silver Honda Accord. The city skyline slowly faded behind him as he made his way toward a quiet, suburban neighborhood. The radio played softly, but his mind remained occupied by the same troubling calculations. At exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, he pulled into the pickup lane outside Willow Creek Elementary School. Children poured through the doors carrying backpacks almost as large as themselves. Parents waved from parked vehicles. Teachers smiled and directed traffic. Then Ethan saw her. Lily Brooks came running down the sidewalk with a bright grin and a stack of books pressed against her chest. "Dad," she called. Ethan's serious expression immediately softened. "Hey, kiddo." She climbed into the passenger seat and fastened her seatbelt. "How was work?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Complicated. Good complicated or bad complicated? I am still figuring that out." Lily nodded thoughtfully, as if she understood more than most 10-year-olds would. In many ways, she did. Life had taught both of them to appreciate simple moments. The drive home took 20 minutes. Their small 2-bedroom house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees and modest front porches. It was not large. It was not impressive, but it was theirs. Inside, family photos covered the hallway walls. School drawings decorated the refrigerator. A faint scent of cinnamon lingered from the cookies Lily had baked with a neighbor over the weekend. Ethan placed his bag beside the kitchen table and began preparing dinner. Nothing fancy, just grilled chicken, vegetables, and rice. Lily worked on homework nearby. The rhythm of ordinary life settled around them like a familiar blanket. Looking at his daughter, nobody would have guessed Ethan once stood at the center of projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Years earlier, he had been one of the most respected data architects in the country. Companies sought his advice. Industry conferences invited him to speak. His systems still powered financial models used across multiple industries. Then everything changed. After losing his wife, Ethan stepped away from the career that had consumed so much of his life. Promotions no longer mattered. Recognition no longer mattered. Raising Lily did. The world moved on without him, and he quietly allowed it to happen. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Hale remained surrounded by advisors and executives preparing documents for final approval. The acquisition package was scheduled for completion within 48 hours. Investors were celebrating. Analysts were optimistic. Millions of dollars were already moving into position. Yet hundreds of pages away from the headlines and excitement, one hidden flaw remained untouched. And as Ethan opened his laptop later that evening to review the numbers one more time, a cold realization settled into his mind. The mistake was even bigger than he had first believed. The house was quiet long after sunset. Outside, a cool spring breeze moved gently through the maple trees lining the street. Inside, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated Ethan Brooks's kitchen table. Empty coffee cups sat beside scattered printouts. His laptop screen reflected in his glasses as rows of numbers stretched across the display. Most people would have stopped hours ago. Most people would have trusted the experts. Ethan could not. Not because he enjoyed proving people wrong. Not because he wanted recognition. He simply knew what happened when small mistakes were ignored. They grew. Around 10:30, he finally found it. The source of the problem was hidden inside a third-party market forecast imported months earlier. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The projections were polished. The assumptions looked reasonable. The charts were impressive. But one data stream had been duplicated and weighted twice inside the predictive model. The duplication was subtle, almost invisible, yet every forecast built on top of it became increasingly distorted. Ethan leaned back in his chair and slowly exhaled. He checked the calculations again. Then again. The conclusion never changed. The projected earnings used to justify the acquisition had been inflated by nearly $700 million. Not intentionally, not fraud, just a catastrophic chain of analytical errors feeding each other. The kind of mistake that could survive dozens of reviews because everyone assumed someone else had already verified it. Across town, lights still glowed inside the upper floors of Hale Dynamics headquarters. Teams worked late preparing final documentation. The acquisition had become the company's flagship project. Investors were excited. Financial media outlets had already begun speculating about the announcement. The momentum felt unstoppable, and that was exactly what worried Ethan. The next morning he arrived early. The elevators were nearly empty. Cleaning crews moved quietly through hallways. Fresh coffee filled the air. Ethan sat at his workstation and prepared a detailed report. Every formula, every source, every calculation, every explanation. He left nothing to interpretation. By 9 o'clock, he emailed the report to senior leadership. Then he waited. The first response arrived less than 20 minutes later. It came from Martin Keller, one of the executive vice presidents overseeing the acquisition. The message contained only 2 sentences. "We appreciate your concern. The analysis has already been validated by experts." Ethan stared at the screen. A few minutes later, another email arrived. Then another. The tone remained polite but dismissive. One executive suggested he misunderstood the model. Another implied he lacked access to certain proprietary assumptions. By lunchtime, word had spread through several departments. The temporary contractor thought he had discovered a flaw in the company's biggest deal. Some employees found the story amusing. Others found it annoying. A few openly mocked the idea. Late that afternoon, Ethan was summoned to a conference room. 3 senior managers sat waiting. Their expressions were professional but impatient. One of them folded his hands. "Ethan, you are making a serious claim." "I know. 3 consulting firms reviewed this." "I understand." Another manager leaned forward. "Do you honestly believe hundreds of experienced professionals missed something that you found alone?" Ethan remained calm. "The numbers do not care how many people reviewed them." Silence followed. The managers exchanged looks. One shook his head. Another forced a smile. "You are a contractor, Ethan." The words hung in the room. Not cruel, not angry, simply dismissive. A reminder of where they believed he belonged. Ethan gathered his papers. "Then please verify the calculations yourself." As he walked out, he realized something important. The problem was no longer the data. The problem was certainty. Everyone trusted the model because everyone trusted each other. Nobody wanted to be the first person to question a decision already moving toward approval. And somewhere above them all, the clock continued ticking. In less than 48 hours, the acquisition would be finalized, unless someone found the courage to stop and look more closely. The following morning arrived with the sharp energy of a company preparing for a historic announcement. Employees moved quickly through the headquarters of Hale Dynamics. Elevators opened and closed without pause. Assistants hurried between conference rooms carrying tablets and presentation materials. Financial reporters had already begun gathering in the lobby. Investors were flying in from New York, Dallas, and San Francisco. Everywhere Ethan Brooks looked, he saw people celebrating a success that had not happened yet. By 8 o'clock, an unexpected message appeared in his inbox. "Conference room Atlas. 10:30 sharp. Attendance required." No explanation followed. Ethan read the message twice before quietly closing his laptop. Across the building, Victoria Hale stood inside her private office overlooking the city. Her executive team surrounded her. Legal advisors reviewed documents. Public relations specialists discussed media strategy. Everything was ready. Everything except one problem. The contractor who refused to stop questioning the numbers. Victoria stared at a printed copy of Ethan's report resting on her desk. She had not ignored it. In fact, she had spent part of the previous evening reviewing several pages herself. The calculations seemed unusually detailed, uncomfortably detailed. Yet every senior advisor around her insisted the acquisition remained sound. By 10:30, Atlas conference room was filled. Board members occupied one side of the table. Senior executives occupied the other. Several major investors joined remotely through enormous wall screens. The atmosphere felt less like a meeting and more like a courtroom for ideas. Ethan entered quietly and took a seat near the end of the table. Conversations softened. A few people exchanged knowing smiles. Others looked annoyed. Victoria entered moments later. Her presence immediately settled the room. She thanked everyone for attending and reviewed the purpose of the session. Then she paused. Her eyes moved toward Ethan. "We are here because one member of this organization believes our acquisition model contains a significant error." Several executives shifted in their seats. One investor raised an eyebrow. Another leaned forward with curiosity. Victoria folded her hands. "Mr. Brooks has expressed concerns repeatedly. Today he will have an opportunity to explain them." The room grew still. One executive could not hide his amusement. "This should be interesting." A few quiet chuckles followed. Ethan remained calm. Victoria noticed. Most people became defensive under pressure. Most people rushed to justify themselves. Ethan simply sat there, composed, as if the opinions around him carried no weight at all. Victoria stepped closer to the center screen. You have challenged conclusions reviewed by some of the best analysts in the industry. She looked directly at him. You have challenged consultants, auditors, executives, and board members. The room waited. Her voice remained professional, but a sharper edge entered her words. So let us make this simple. She pressed a button and the acquisition forecast appeared across the massive display. Revenue projections glowed in blue and gold. Growth curves climbed confidently upward. $700 million rested behind those assumptions. Victoria crossed her arms. You have 15 minutes. Silence settled over the room. If your concerns are valid, we will pause the acquisition immediately. Several executives looked surprised. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Victoria continued. But if you cannot support your claims, then this discussion ends today. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every eye turned toward Ethan. The challenge hung in the air like the final note of a bell. Slowly, Ethan stood. He gathered a single folder and walked toward the screen. His expression never changed. His voice remained steady. That seems fair. For the first time that morning, the confidence inside the room began to shift. Because the man everyone expected to retreat had accepted without hesitation. And somewhere deep inside Victoria Hale, a small uncomfortable question finally appeared. What if he was not bluffing at all? For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The giant screen behind Ethan displayed the acquisition forecast in all its polished confidence. Blue lines climbed upward. Revenue projections stretched into the future. Market expansion estimates promised extraordinary growth. To most people in the room, the numbers looked impressive. To Ethan, they looked fragile. He connected his laptop to the presentation system and calmly opened a different file. Several executives exchanged amused glances. One investor checked his watch. Another leaned back in his chair as if expecting a short and forgettable explanation. Ethan began quietly. I am not here to challenge anyone's intelligence. The room remained silent. I am here because numbers tell the truth whether we like the answer or not. A few expressions hardened. Others became curious. Ethan clicked to the next slide. Instead of charts, a simple spreadsheet appeared. Rows of raw data filled the screen. Nothing glamorous. Nothing impressive. Just information. This is the source data used to generate the revenue forecast. He pointed towards several highlighted sections. And this is where the problem begins. One executive immediately interrupted. That dataset has already been reviewed. Ethan nodded. Yes. Multiple times. Yes. The executive folded his arms. Then what exactly are we looking at? Ethan zoomed in. A duplication. Several people frowned. The word sounded almost insignificant. Duplication. Hardly the kind of discovery capable of threatening a $700 million acquisition. Ethan clicked again. A second spreadsheet appeared beside the first. Then a third. Then a fourth. Slowly, he walked the room through the process. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Simply one fact after another. One data stream had been imported from two separate reporting systems. The systems used different labels, different formatting, different naming conventions. Because of those differences, the model treated both sources as independent revenue signals. In reality, they represented the same activity, the same customers, the same transactions, the same projected growth. A board member leaned forward. You are saying the model counted future demand twice? Ethan nodded. At first, yes. Murmurs spread across the room. Victoria remained silent. Her eyes never left the screen. Ethan continued. The duplication alone would not be catastrophic. Several executives visibly relaxed. Then Ethan opened another slide. Unfortunately, it did not stop there. The room grew quiet again. He revealed a series of interconnected forecasting layers. Market expansion assumptions. Customer retention multipliers. Automated growth projections. Every stage relied on outputs generated by the stage before it. Like mirrors reflecting mirrors, the original error continued growing. Small distortions became larger ones. Larger distortions became strategic assumptions. Strategic assumptions became financial projections. The confidence inside the room began to fade. Investors stopped checking their phones. Executives stopped whispering. Even the people who had laughed earlier now watched carefully. Ethan clicked forward again. Another chart appeared. Then another. Then another. The numbers no longer looked impressive. They looked unstable. Victoria slowly uncrossed her arms. For the first time that morning, uncertainty touched her expression. One consultant adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the calculations on his own tablet. A second consultant did the same. Neither looked comfortable. Ethan's voice remained steady. The model did not fail because people were careless. He paused. It failed because everyone trusted the previous review. Silence settled over the conference room. The air felt heavier now. The confidence that had filled the building for days was beginning to crack. Then Ethan opened one final folder. Its title appeared on the giant screen. Actual exposure analysis. Several people immediately sat upright. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Because whatever was inside that file had not been included in any report the board had seen before. The conference room felt different now. The confidence that had filled the space an hour earlier was gone. In its place sat something quieter, something heavier. Ethan Brooks stood beside the giant screen while dozens of eyes remained fixed on the final file he had just opened. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody checked a phone. Even the distant hum of the building seemed to fade into the background. Ethan clicked forward. A new chart appeared. This one was simple, clean, impossible to misunderstand. Across the bottom ran a timeline of projected growth. Along the side appeared estimated revenue. Two lines crossed the screen. The first represented the company's official forecast. The second represented the corrected forecast after removing the duplicated data streams and recalculating every dependent model. The gap between them was enormous. Several people blinked as if they had read the numbers incorrectly. Ethan allowed a few seconds of silence before speaking. This is the actual exposure. His voice remained calm. If the acquisition proceeds using the current assumptions, projected performance will fall short by approximately $700 million over the evaluation period. Nobody moved. One investor slowly lowered his glasses. Another leaned forward until his elbows touched the table. Across the room, one consultant opened his laptop and began entering formulas at remarkable speed. Ethan continued. The acquisition itself is not the problem. He pointed toward the corrected figures. The valuation is. Another click. Another slide. This time the consequences became visible. Debt obligations. Investor expectations. Expansion commitments. Hiring forecasts. Strategic spending plans. Every major decision had been built on projections that no longer existed. The room seemed to hold its breath. A board member finally spoke. Are these numbers verified? Ethan nodded. 3 times. The consultant who had been recalculating looked up from his screen. His face had lost all color. I am getting the same result. The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread across the room. Quiet whispers began. Several executives exchanged worried looks. One investor closed his notebook completely and stared at the screen. Victoria Hale remained seated at the center of the table. Her posture had not changed, yet something behind her eyes had. For years she had trusted her instincts. They had helped her build a billion-dollar company. They had guided her through risks that others considered impossible. But instinct alone could not change mathematics. Slowly she turned toward the consultants. Is he correct? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the senior consultant cleared his throat. Based on what we are seeing. He hesitated. Yes. Silence followed. Deep silence. The kind that arrives when pride steps aside and truth enters the room. Nobody celebrated. Ethan certainly did not. He simply stood beside the screen with the same quiet composure he had carried from the beginning. There was no victory in his expression. No satisfaction. Only concern. Because this had never been about proving himself right. It had been about preventing a mistake. Victoria lowered her eyes to the report resting before her. The challenge she had issued now echoed in her memory. For the first time in many years, she realized she had measured someone by their title instead of their character. The room remained frozen. And in that extraordinary stillness, every person present understood the same thing. The temporary contractor they had dismissed had just saved the company from a decision that could have changed everything. The meeting ended without celebration. There were no handshakes, no victory speeches, no applause. People simply gathered their materials in silence and left the conference room carrying the weight of what they had just witnessed. The acquisition was immediately paused. Emergency reviews were scheduled. Investors requested updated reports. Consultants returned to their offices to verify every assumption from the ground up. Yet the person responsible for exposing the problem attracted the least attention of all. Ethan Brooks quietly disconnected his laptop, placed it inside his worn leather bag, and walked out of the building. By the time most executives reached their next meeting, he was already driving toward Willow Creek Elementary. The afternoon sun hung low above the trees as Lily climbed into the passenger seat with a smile. "How was your day, Dad?" she asked. Ethan smiled back. "Busy. Good busy. I think so." Lily nodded and began talking about a science project while Ethan listened carefully. To him, the conversation mattered more than anything that had happened inside the boardroom. Across the city, Victoria Hale remained in her office long after everyone else had left. The skyline glowed beyond the glass walls as evening settled over Chicago. A folder sat open on her desk. Ethan Brooks, temporary contractor, data analyst. That was all she expected to find. Instead, the deeper she looked, the more questions appeared. Former chief systems architect, designer of predictive infrastructure still used by major corporations, speaker at national technology conferences, author of several influential research papers, recipient of awards she recognized immediately. Victoria stared at the screen. None of this matched the quiet man who packed lunches for his daughter and drove an aging Honda Accord. She continued reading. Several years earlier, Ethan had voluntarily stepped away from a career that most professionals spent their entire lives pursuing. Promotions disappeared from his record after his wife's passing. Public appearances stopped. Consulting contracts declined. Industry interviews ended. It was as if he had quietly stepped out of the spotlight and never returned. Victoria leaned back slowly. The realization unsettled her. She had assumed she was looking at an inexperienced contractor questioning experts. In reality, one of the experts had been sitting in the room all along. The next morning, she requested additional records. More details arrived. Former colleagues described Ethan using the same words again and again. Brilliant, humble, precise, reliable. One executive from a Fortune 500 company wrote a single sentence that captured her attention. "If Ethan Brooks tells you a number is wrong, start looking for the mistake." Victoria read the line twice. Then a third time. A quiet feeling settled over her. Respect. Not for what Ethan had done in the conference room. For what he had chosen not to do. He had never insulted anyone. Never embarrassed anyone. Never demanded recognition. Even after being dismissed, he remained patient. Even after being challenged publicly, he remained gracious. Late that afternoon, Victoria received another surprise. A notification from Human Resources appeared on her screen. Ethan Brooks had submitted a formal resignation notice. Effective immediately, she stared at the message in disbelief. After everything that had happened, he was preparing to leave. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she stood, picked up her coat, and made a decision. Because for the first time in years, Victoria Hale realized that losing $700 million might not have been the company's greatest risk. Losing Ethan Brooks could be far more costly. The following Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and cool air drifting through the quiet streets of Willow Creek. Ethan Brooks stood in his driveway helping Lily adjust the chain on her bicycle. The neighborhood was peaceful. Wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a lawn mower hummed in the distance. It was the kind of ordinary morning Ethan valued most. No conference rooms. No presentations. No arguments about numbers. Just time with his daughter. Lily tightened her helmet and smiled. "Race you to the corner?" Ethan laughed. "You win every time." Before she could respond, a dark sedan slowly pulled to the curb. Ethan recognized it immediately. Victoria Hale stepped out. Gone was the commanding presence of the executive boardroom. Gone were the assistants, advisors, and polished presentations. She wore simple clothes, carried no briefcase, and for a moment seemed unsure of what to say. Lily glanced at her father. "Friend from work?" Ethan smiled softly. "Something like that." Victoria approached slowly. "Good morning." "Good morning," Ethan replied. Neither spoke for several seconds. The silence felt different from the one inside Hale Dynamics. This silence carried humility instead of tension. Victoria looked toward Lily. "You must be Lily." Lily nodded politely. "Nice to meet you." Victoria smiled. "Nice to meet you too." Ethan noticed something unusual. Victoria seemed nervous. Not afraid. Not uncomfortable. Simply human. She turned back toward him. I received your resignation. Ethan nodded. I thought you might. Why? He looked toward the quiet street. Because I was hired to solve problems. This one is solved. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. That is not the only reason. Ethan said nothing. She took a slow breath. I owe you an apology. The words came without hesitation, without excuses, without qualifications. I judged you before I knew you. I looked at your position instead of your experience. I looked at your title instead of your character. Ethan remained quiet. Victoria continued. When you spoke, I assumed confidence belonged to the people with the highest offices. I was wrong. The morning breeze moved gently through the trees. Somewhere behind them, a wind chime rang softly. Lily listened without fully understanding the details, but she understood enough to recognize sincerity when she heard it. Ethan finally smiled. Apology accepted. Victoria exhaled as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Then she laughed quietly. That was easier than I expected. Life is complicated enough without carrying unnecessary grudges. Victoria nodded. The answer sounded exactly like something she had read in the reports from Ethan's former colleagues. Calm, direct, grounded. She glanced around the small home. The bicycles, the flower pots, the drawings visible through the kitchen window. Suddenly she understood something no corporate biography had explained. Ethan had not abandoned success. He had simply chosen a different definition of it. Lily rolled her bicycle forward. Dad says numbers are important. Victoria smiled. Your dad is right. Lily grinned. He says people are more important. This time Victoria did not answer immediately. She looked at Ethan, then at Lily, then at the quiet life standing before her. Your dad is right about that too. A warm silence followed. Not the silence of embarrassment. Not the silence of defeat. The silence that appears when truth becomes clear. Then Victoria reached into her bag and removed a sealed envelope. She handed it to Ethan. I came here to ask for something. Ethan looked at the envelope but did not open it. Victoria smiled gently. And I think it might be the most important offer I have ever made. Ethan looked at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No complicated contract. No pages of legal language. No executive jargon. Just a simple proposal. Strategic partner. Ethan read the title once and then looked up. Victoria smiled. I am not offering you a job. He raised an eyebrow. No. I am offering you a seat at the table. The morning sun reflected softly across the quiet street. Lily stood nearby holding her bicycle, watching the exchange with curious eyes. Victoria continued. The acquisition has been permanently suspended. The board approved a complete review of every forecasting system in the company. Ethan nodded. That seems wise. Victoria laughed softly. That is probably the most polite way anyone has ever said we needed fixing. For the first time, both of them smiled. The tension that once existed between them had disappeared. In its place stood something stronger. Mutual respect. Victoria glanced toward the house. I spent years building a company. Her voice grew quieter. Somewhere along the way I started believing titles mattered more than people. Ethan listened without interrupting. Then you walked into that room and reminded me what leadership actually looks like. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Leaves rustled overhead. The neighborhood remained peaceful, far from investors, far from boardrooms, far from the noise that usually surrounded billion-dollar decisions. Ethan folded the proposal and slipped it back into the envelope. I appreciate the offer. Victoria studied him carefully. But, Ethan smiled. My first responsibility is still Lily. Victoria looked toward his daughter. I know. Then she surprised him. That is exactly why I want you involved. Ethan remained silent. Victoria continued. You built a life around what matters most. People trust your judgment because you are not chasing attention. That is rare. Lily finally spoke. Dad is really good at saying no. Both adults laughed. I am beginning to notice that, Victoria said. Ethan looked down at his daughter and then back toward Victoria. For years he had avoided opportunities that threatened the balance he worked so hard to create. Yet something about this felt different. There was no pressure, no ego, no need to prove anything, just a chance to help build something better. Several weeks later, Hale Dynamics announced a complete restructuring of its forecasting division. The company publicly acknowledged the modeling error and implemented new safeguards. Investors praised the transparency. Industry analysts called it one of the most responsible corporate decisions of the year. Ethan accepted a limited advisory role that allowed him to remain present for Lily while contributing his expertise when needed. The arrangement worked. More importantly, it reflected the values he refused to compromise. Months passed. The $700 million mistake slowly faded from headlines and financial reports. New projects replaced old stories. Markets moved on. People always do. Yet inside Hale Dynamics, one memory remained. Employees still talked about the day a quiet single father challenged a room full of experts and saved the company from its own certainty. Not because he embarrassed anyone, not because he demanded recognition, but because he demonstrated something far more powerful: character. And whenever Victoria Hale walked into the conference room where it happened, she remembered the silence that followed the truth. Not an uncomfortable silence, not a defeated silence. The kind of silence that appears when pride steps aside, wisdom enters the room, and everyone finally sees a person's true value.